welcome to Ruby like it's 1995. I'm Matias. That's me on Twitter, that's me on GitHub, and that's me on the internet. And I'm a developer at a Finnish software consultancy called ginclude. And Rails is one of the main tools we use to get our work done. And in fact, we're pretty sure we've done the most Rails projects of any company in Finland. And so, as you can imagine, Ruby is pretty near and dear to our hearts. So, let's have a little show of hands. What was your first version of Ruby you ever used? 2.x? For a few people. 1.9? Fewer than I thought there would be. 1.8? All right, about even still. Below 1.8? One person. What version was it? 1.7.2. And last year, I happened to go across this tweet from Matz, celebrating Ruby's 25th birthday, according to the way he reckons it is. It's from the day he named Ruby. And that led me to consider the very early days of Ruby. So let's take a walk down memory lane and cast your minds back to 1995. Sorry, that's not very 90s at all. It's better. Slightly better. Oh, there we go. Yeah. People are dressing like this, and like this, and Gangsta's Paradise is the top hit of the year. Followed by Staying Alive by Entrance. And Kiss from a Rose by Seal. Oh yeah, and Batman Forever is a thing. And Windows 95 is the hot new OS. And Friends is the hottest show on TV, and the combination of which leads to this awesome video.
There are 4 things you ought to know about Windows 95. It's easier, it's faster, it's more powerful, and it's got great compatibility. Now, point the mouse at the start button, bottom left, and click.
Oh, look, Maddie, I'm computing.
Yes. Look, Maddie, I'm computing. And I just turned 9. And in December, Matz publishes Ruby 0.95, which is the very first public release of Ruby. And if we look at the features from the original release announcement, it looks a lot like Ruby. You don't need to explicitly type your variables. The scope for variables is defined by name. It looks very familiar. There's exception handling, iterators, garbage collection, all that good Ruby stuff. And there's even a nice little Hello World example in there. And at some point last year, I realized you can still go download Ruby 0.95, which led me to this question. Could I run Ruby 0.95? How hard could it be? I mean, it's just a relatively small amount of C code. Though, unfortunately, the documentation is in Japanese. which leads me to problem number 1. I don't understand Japanese. And it also turns out that compiling 20-year-old code is not entirely easy. Well, my first try, I'll just compile it. Let's see what happens. And not on macOS. Because macOS was first released 6 years after Ruby 0.95. Okay, I think we'll just use Linux. But we also can't use 64-bit Linux, since 64-bit CPUs weren't really a thing in 1995. So we'll use 32-bit Linux. No problem, I thought. I'll use a virtual machine. But computer says no. You also can't use a modern version of Linux, because the modern Linux means modern compilers. And this will turn out to be very important. So let's take a little look at the Ruby 0.95 source to find the problem. See that last line there? To understand the problem, we need to take a little look at the GCC source code. And as a quick aside, if you don't know what GCC is, it's the GNU compiler collection, and it supports compiling a whole lot of different languages. But for this talk, all you really need to know is that it compiles C. But back to where we were. We were looking at this very last line on this slide, and to understand this issue, we need to take a little peek at GCC source code. Specifically this varargs.h file. And varargs was the way you could make C functions take multiple arguments, or a variable number of arguments rather. As you can imagine, that's pretty important for Ruby for things like arrays. However, varargs.h no longer exists. In fact, it was removed 17 years ago. So at least based on this commit, we now know that we need to use a version of GCC that was released before July 2002. So version 3.1 or less. No problem, I thought. I'll just compile GCC 3.1 myself. Now, who wants to guess what happens when you try and compile a 17-year-old version of GCC? So this is where the descent into madness begins. So I thought maybe I could just use a really old version of Debian. I mean, it's been around forever, and I think I mostly know how to use it. And what's more, it appears that Debian 3.0 Woody shipped with GCC 2.95. So at least it should have that varargs implementation. But it turns out that my Linux skills would not be any good 20 years ago. I mostly couldn't even get packages installed. And can you believe that the package mirrors for Debian 3 are dead? And it doesn't support HTTP apt mirrors, so you can't use the new ones either. So I thought, how about I use a whole chain of GCC? I take the oldest GCC I can find and use that to compile a slightly older version of GCC, and so forth. Enter a tool called dbootstrap, or possibly debootstrap. The wiki is not clear on how to pronounce it. But it's a tool that allows you to sort of install a Debian-based system inside another already installed system. So you don't need to run a whole virtual machine. So I get a Ubuntu 12.04 VM set up. That's fine. It works. I can use it. I use it to create a Ubuntu 6.06 environment using debootstrapped. And I use the GCC 3.3 from that to compile GCC 2.8. And it still doesn't work. Okay, so I'll compile GCC 2.7, which, by the way, is from 1995, using GCC 2.8. And that also doesn't work. Which doesn't leave me feeling great. So, after taking a little moment to calm down, I think, okay, let's recap. Problems, we have lots. Number 1, can't read Japanese. Number 2, can't use macOS. Number 3, can't use a 64-bit system. Number 4, can't use a modern compiler. Number 5, you can't compile an old compiler with a modern compiler. Now, problem number 1, it's a bit too late to do anything about that now. Problem number 2 is easily solved by using a Linux VM. And problem number 3, ditto. So if we could just get rid of problem number 4, we also get rid of problem number 5. So, frack it. I'm going on an adventure. I'll just fix the C code. Which leads me to an important fact I failed to mention earlier. I don't know C. That's problem number 6 if you're keeping count. But how hard can it possibly be? So we'll start with the problem we know about, the varargs.h. And I read Wikipedia and some documentation, and I figure out what to do. We need to find every instance where it's used, replace it with standard arg. Then we need to fix the function definition. And finally, we need to add a second argument to this va start call. And then we make these changes everywhere where we need to, where varargs.h is used, and there as well. And then we also backport some fixes from Ruby 1.1, incidentally. And then we fix the same things over and over, and it's starting to look kind of familiar at this point. And in between there, we also have to update the headers for Ruby, because this changes the API. And then we do some other random fixes that I don't really fully understand, but the compiler keeps giving errors, so. And we're almost done. Then I also end up butchering the script that compiles native extensions for Ruby. It's fine. That's the full diff, by the way. So, but you know, who needs sockets anyway? Or Marshall? It's not that important. And remember this release announcement from earlier? It turns out I should have read it a bit more carefully, because there's a follow-up message where Matz sends in a patch to the release. And because it turns out that he sent in a patch on the same day. And there is always something wrong. I think that's kind of a slogan for software development. And handily, the Ruby 095 download does not include this patch. So unless you go read that release announcement, you'll never know that it's broken. So I apply that patch too. And now we're ready for the million-dollar question. Does it compile? Yes. We have a binary. It runs, Ruby 095, for 21st of December, 1995. But does it run Ruby? Yes. So there's no IRB, and there's also no puts. So we echo some Ruby to the executable, and we get some nice printout. And you can even run some of the, that's right, you can even run some of, you can even run some of the original examples, like this one that lists all the files in a directory. You get some output, but there are also some caveats. For one thing, it's seg false if you look at it wrong, and I haven't quite figured out why. A lot of things are strange or missing. Like I mentioned, there's no puts. So you need to use print instead. There's no HTTP support at all, and that would be true even if I hadn't discarded socket support. There are no date or datetime classes, but you do get a time class. There's no IRB, like I said. And then some things are just plain weird. Booleans are written in all caps. class inheritance looks like this. The syntax would change to the more familiar angle brackets in Ruby 099. And there's a whole separate module for parsing dates. And yes, it does assume that years are 2 digits and they're all in the 20th century. But the main point is, it lives even if it is in a sort of undead sort of way. And just before I end, let's have a little look at some numbers. Let's compare Ruby 095 to 2.6. So 095, 300 kilobytes approximately, and then Ruby 2.6, almost 16 megabytes. And these are both gzipped. Number of files, Ruby 095, almost 160 files, and Ruby 2.6 approaching 10,000 files. Lines of code is quite interesting. Modern versions of Ruby actually include more Ruby than C code, which is nice. And in fact, Ruby 2.6 has more lines of make files than Ruby 095 had lines of Ruby. And then a quick reminder of how long ago 1995 actually was. Because if you're like me, you always think that the 90s were 10 years ago, and they weren't. So we got Ruby 2.6 in 2018, December, 2.5 the year before, 2.4, also Rails 5, 2.3, 2.2, 2.1, Rails 4 in 2013. Ruby 2.0, also at the beginning of 2013, and Rails 3 in between there, and Ruby 1.9 in 2007, and also Rails 2, Rails 1 in 2005, it's the very first version of Rails. That's 10 years after the first version of Ruby. Ruby 1.8 came out in 2003. In 2000 we get 1.6. 1999, 1.4, 98, 1.2, 96, 1.0, and then right there at the edge, Ruby 0.95. I think that makes it 24 years in total. So what could you do next with this? Well, you could try using something like the GNU debugger to figure out why it's segfaults. If you had more time, then not very much sense. Or you could use Ruby 2.6, which is glorious and practically never segfaults. Or you could just use mruby if you actually need a very small Ruby. Thanks.